And furthermore, how could someone even trap the night itself? It doesn't make any sense.
Hello, fellow netizens, and welcome to Scandalous Games, the show where we take a closer look at video game-related controversies. I'm Kevin Impellizeri, and I do the research and share the story of a video game-related controversy to my friends.
Hey, I'm Phil Thomas, and you can still consider me a video game newbie.
I'm Andy Hunter, a lifelong gamer, but mostly just Nintendo, Mario, Zelda, and Pokemon.
I'm Elford Stephens. I've been playing video games for 30 plus years now and still growing strong.
All right, here we are at the end of our huge series on the question of how video games got age ratings in the United States. In our last couple episodes, we talked about various tech fads that influenced the thoughts about technology and video games during the early 1990s. Things like virtual reality and full motion video games got people thinking that we could be really close to super immersive interactive experiences, but also that could raise a whole bunch of different concerns, like creating interactive snuff films or just full-on sex scenes that you play with your teledildonic data glove and iPhones. And then we talked a bit about the concerns over violent crime, both the fact that there were several video games that were pushing the boundaries of taste, most notably Mortal Kombat, and also that this happened in the backdrop of a really big concern about violent crime. Now, in the midst of all of that, on December the 1st, 1993, U.S. Senator Joseph Lieberman hosted a press conference announcing his intention to push the video game industry to regulate its content. In an environment of heightened anxieties over violent crime, especially youth crime, Lieberman felt depictions of violence and sex in video games were making the situation worse and that the industry needed to do more to inform parents and protect children, or the government would do it for them. This set the stage for a congressional hearing on video game violence held on December the 9th, 1993. And so we are finally going to talk directly about this confrontation between video games and mainstream American society. But before we do that, we need some context, because I think before we get into the hearing, it's really important to briefly cover what measures, if any, video game companies had already in place before the congressional hearing. And to do that, we're going to examine how the two biggest companies in the industry at the time, those were Nintendo and Sega, handled the home release of Mortal Kombat, that gory one-on-one fighting game that made its home debut for the Sega Genesis, Game Gear, Super Nintendo, and Game Boy on September the 13th, 1993, aka Mortal Monday. So why don't we start with Nintendo? So Nintendo had been around in the American video game industry since the early 1980s, developing arcade games like Donkey Kong and also handheld systems like the LCD-based Game & Watch series. Now, in the mid-1980s, they decided to get into the console business. So the Nintendo Entertainment System, which first appeared in 1985 to a test audience in the greater New York area, followed by 1986 to a full national release. In short order, the NES became the hot Christmas item, and it wasn't long before a bunch of companies started getting into the game market, mostly by putting games out for the NES. And Nintendo was willing to let them do it, provided they played by Nintendo's rules. And Nintendo ruled third-party companies with an iron fist. Nintendo limited the number of titles a given publisher could put out per year. They controlled all manufacturing, and they enforced compliance with the lockout chip they installed in the NES, which would basically make any game that wasn't produced by Nintendo basically inoperable on the NES. I will say, however, companies did eventually manage to circumvent the lockout chip, but that's a story for another episode. Now, in addition to controlling supply, Nintendo also controlled content. Nintendo of America had a very specific image of video games and their audience during the late 80s and the early 1990s. They were kids' toys, specifically targeting the ages 8 to 12 demographic. So the Big N was going to make damn sure the likes of Capcom, Konami, and Acclaim weren't going to mess with that family-friendly image. And to that end, in 1988, Nintendo rolled out a set of strict content guidelines. And before a given company could put out an NES game, they needed to submit its content to Nintendo for approval. Like I said, Nintendo handled all the manufacturing of the cartridges. So if you wanted a game to come out for an NES, you had to get clearance by Nintendo. Among the content guidelines were bans on sexually explicit or suggestive material, such as racy outfits or nudity, profane language, racist and sexist depictions of characters, religious imagery, overt political or propagandistic messages, presentations of drugs or alcohol, and excessive violence, including domestic violence, graphic depictions of death, and, quote, excessive force in a sports game beyond what is inherent in actual contact sports, unquote. Nintendo mandated content changes ran the gamut. For example, the American version of Castlevania for the NES swapped out Simon Belmont's crosses in the Japanese game for X-shaped boomerangs. Mike Tyson's Punch-Out's Russian boxer went from vodka Drunkinsky in the arcade version to soda Popinski in the NES version.
That's awesome.
The Super NES port of Final Fight removed female enemies, replacing them with male ones to avoid accusations of sexism or domestic violence. And in one extreme example, the Super NES version of Wolfenstein 3D removed not just the blood and the swastikas, but also Hitler's mustache.
You are merely fighting nondescript, mean, clean-shaven person. I hate that guy.
In light of all of this, let's turn back to Mortal Kombat. So publisher Acclaim gave the job of adapting the game to the Super Nintendo to Sculptured Software, better known on this show for their work on Captain Novolin and Rex Ronan Experimental Surgeon. And if you need a refresher on those titles, check out our previous episode on the Health Era series. So what did Nintendo's content guidelines mean for a fighting game rooted in violent action? For one thing, the blood had to go. So the devs at Sculptured Software changed its color to clear so it looked like sweat. They also had to dial back a bunch of the fatalities. Now, some remained intact, however, others were heavily edited. For example, Sub-Zero no longer had his trademark head-ripping move. Now he freezes his opponent and shatters them instead. Some thanks to edits come off as downright silly. Take Kano, for example. In the arcade version, he rips out his opponent's still beating heart and holds his triumphantly. In the Super NES version, he kind of just massages their chests and they fall over while he triumphantly holds up nothing.
Yeah, I think Kane is saying, imagine if your heart were in this hand though, dude, right?
You could also still knock Johnny Cage down a pit of spikes, but blood no longer sprays out when you do it.
Yeah, it's hard to tell, but there's actually like a perfect silhouette of no spikes at the bottom that Johnny Cage just lands right between them every time.
All of this calls out an issue with Nintendo's contact guidelines. Now, while on paper, it may sound straightforward enough to say that, we can't have this or that in a Nintendo game. In practice, what did or did not get Nintendo's approval often came off as inconsistent. So fighting games such as Street Fighter 2 and Mortal Kombat were still violent fighters. You're still punching and kicking, even if you don't have violent finishers. And the inclusion of women, such as Chun-Li and Sonya Blade, would suggest that Nintendo was still okay with violence against women under certain circumstances. You saw similar concessions in other games. For example, Capcom's Bionic Commando, which was released for NES in 1988, let you graphically blow up Hitler's face. There he goes.
Well, wait, who is this mustachioed guy? Is he like an even worse version of mean, clean-shaven guy that I hate?
Now, I'll point out that fans at the time hated what Nintendo's meddling did to Mortal Kombat. For example, Ed Semrat at EGM pulled no punches with Nintendo in an editorial for the September 1993 issue, calling out both Nintendo's restrictions and the hypocrisy of limiting only specific aspects of a game built on violence, saying, quote, "How bad is the Super NES version? Real bad if you're looking for an arcade clone. For example, Sub-Zero now freezes his opponent and the loser shatters into ice cubes. That's a far cry from pulling your opponent's head and spine off the body. Most of the other finishing moves are equally as bad. All of this, of course, has been done to preserve Nintendo's pristine reputation of presenting only wholesome games to its audience. But sorry, Nintendo, you can turn the blood into sweat, modify the fatalities, and change a few words in the instruction book, but the bottom line is that no matter how much you sanitize the game, it still involves people killing people, some of them women. And I bet there isn't an 8-year-old in the country that doesn't know the real premise behind this game. Also, come around Christmas time, there'll be a lot of unsuspecting moms buying this card for their kids, and I'm sure they'll have a different impression of the Nintendo seal of approval once they hear Johnny yelling, "Kill him," as he puts the finishing move to his opponent. The fact is that the big N can order the game on the screen change, but the plot is still very real to the players. So what have you accomplished, Nintendo? Not a lot, other than make everybody unhappy. The players are upset they didn't get the real game, and the parents won't like the half-hearted changes, end quote.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, and especially, even just considering like the game is not called friendly combat. It's still called Mortal Kombat. So calling this change half-hearted is, I think, a fair criticism.
Kevin, do you know of any pushback that Nintendo got sales-wise from forcing them to sanitize the game? Do you think they did any less sales, or was it still a huge success?
Oh my, yes, they took a hit in sales. Let me compare you to the Genesis version, and then we'll talk about the disparity in sales. So with all that in mind, let's turn to the other bigger player in the American game market in 1993, Sega. Another Japanese company that had put out arcade games in the US in the early 80s. Sega released its first American console with the Master System in 1986. However, the Master System was no match for the juggernaut that was the Nintendo Entertainment System, and it failed to make a meaningful impact in the United States. However, with the release of their next system, the Genesis, in 1989, Sega of America was determined to not lose to Nintendo again. And Sega's marketing for the Genesis aimed at the house that Mario built with both barrels. Ads frequently put Nintendo games side by side with games on Sega systems. For example, when the GameCube came out in 1991, commercials made sure you knew it had full color, unlike the crappy Game Boy with its paltry black and white. The slogan for the Genesis at this time summed up the company's philosophy: Genesis does what Nintendo don't.
I still like to say Genesis does what Nintendo don't anytime I feel like I'm bringing up an old grudge that's been settled a long time ago. Just in any context.
So on top of gunning for Nintendo directly, Sega's marketing targeted an older demographic than Nintendo did with the NES or the Super NES. So instead of that 8 to 12 age range, they went for teens. So as a result, their marketing was dripping with early 1990s attitude, declaring the Sega games are the ones the cool kids are playing. By contrast, they're paying Nintendo as kid stuff. Games your little brother plays, but not you discerning 13 to 21-year-old male. Super Mario World, that's baby shit. Come over to Genesis, we got Guy Aries and fucking Filios. Now, aging of the gaming demographic past Nintendo's family-friendly model remained a weapon in Sega's arsenal throughout the early 1990s. Now, a couple episodes ago, we mentioned FMV games, and a lot of the push for full-motion video games was trying to age up the gaming demographic and focus on more mature themes in games. We talked about Digital Pictures, and Digital Pictures was really actively involved in Sega. So the Sega CD, which was a CD-ROM based add-on for the Genesis, comes out in 92. And Digital Pictures put out a bunch of games for it: Night Trap and Double Switch and Sewer Shark. And they're kind of trying to go for an older audience than was typical. Digital Pictures head Tom Zito explained to a Wall Street Journal reporter in January 1993, he said, quote, "We're changing what is a very limited industry aimed at prepubescent teenage boys. Our research shows adults as well as young teens are buying this stuff. This is very hip and novel," end quote. However, the trade-off for this is that the appeal to older audience made some critics anxious. If kids are playing these video games, what does it mean when we're trying to deal with stuff that adults are going to want to play? So, for example, in January 6, 1993 article on the Sega CD in the Wall Street Journal, Patrick M. Riley observed, quote, "The new generation of CD video games could be flirting with trouble. Many of the new games strain the image of video games as G-rated family entertainment," end quote. Adding, quote, "Some software developers, hoping to avoid outside interference, want to rate video games the way feature films are rated to appease concerned parents and watchdog groups," end quote. And so in pushing for older audiences than Nintendo, executives at Sega clearly saw the writing on the walls. If gaming content was going to start targeting adults, the industry needed to devise ways to protect itself from moral crusaders. And so to that end, on May the 22nd, 1993, Sega of America announced the creation of its own rating system called the Video Game Rating Council, or the VRC. The VRC consisted of an independent body of reviewers who examined a game's content and assigned it one of three age-based letter ratings. Those were GA, which is general audiences. So think of like your G rating for movies, like appropriate for everybody. MA13, which was mature audiences age 13 and up. So think of like your PG-13 rating in movies. And MA17, which is like your R rating in films, mature audiences age 17 and up. To raise awareness of the VRC, Sega also set up a toll-free hotline and entered a deal with publisher Scholastic to put out a pamphlet titled "Everybody Wins: A Message to Parents About Video Games." As a total aside, this is for our listeners. I would love to read this pamphlet, but I haven't been able to find a copy, and I actually reached out to the largest largest repository of video game related resources in the United States. That's the International Center for the History of Electronic Games at the Strong Museum of Play in Rochester, New York, and they don't have a copy either. So if you do have a copy of this around and you're willing to scan it, send me a link, scandalousgamepodcast@gmail.com. So all this, the VRC, what does that mean for Mortal Kombat when it comes out of the Genesis? Well, the VRC assigned Mortal Kombat an MA13, so appropriate for ages 13 and older. And at first glance, if you were to play the Genesis version of Mortal Kombat, it may just seem like the scaled down Super NES counterpart. However, if you boot up the Genesis game, the player will see a title screen with a wall of text that cryptically talks about codes. And if the player happened to enter the button sequence ABACABB on their Sega Genesis controller, the text of that description of a code would change from white to red, and doing so would activate all of the gore from the arcade in all of its 16-bit Sega Genesis glory. And I will tell you this, that blood code was far from a closely guarded secret in 1993, I'll tell you what. As with Nintendo's content guidelines, Sega's VRC also attracted criticism. And one vocal group were the folks at Electronic Gaming Monthly, who throughout 1993 aired out a laundry list of complaints about the rating system, including that Sega wasn't doing enough to inform parents about it, that not all third-party companies were adopting it, and that the ratings weren't appearing in advertisements. Some also argued that the ratings were a slippery slope that led towards censorship, with one EGM writer going so far as to call the ratings fascist. Oh yeah, there was another notable critic of the VRC that's worth mentioning. Nintendo. Following Sega's announcement at the launch of the VRC, Peter Main, who was Nintendo of America's vice president of marketing, put out a statement on behalf of the company accusing Sega of creating the Video Game Rating Council as, quote, a smokescreen for more violent video games, end quote, adding that things would just be so much better if everyone would just let Nintendo dictate what should or should not appear in a video game, saying that Nintendo, quote, believes the future of the video game industry rests upon adhering to a policy of internal standards and extensive game evaluation, not on unenforceable rating systems, end quote. So we're at a bit of an impasse in terms of how to regulate video game content.
Nintendo clearly wants to curtail anything it's not willing to publish on any other platform to prevent any type of competition at all, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, it's just so funny to me that one person would be criticizing Sega's ratings by calling it a form of censorship, whereas Nintendo is the one actually like refusing to publish certain things at all. Whereas Sega is publishing, albeit with the sticker saying parents don't let a kid under a certain age buy this. So it's just funny that it would seem of the two that what Nintendo's doing would meet a more strict definition of censorship.
Now, in all fairness, game magazines did point out the fact that what Nintendo was doing was worse, that they were legitimately censoring games. But they also, what's interesting, like magazines like EGM and GamePro were also initially really against a rating system because they feared it would lead to censorship on video games, that basically the game companies would fear that they can't put out specific content because of the rating system. And they also feared that retailers like, Walmart and Toys R Us and all this wouldn't carry games of a certain rating. Now, I will say, skipping ahead, that did end up happening with the ESRB. But so there is a certain concern that video games are going to start getting censored. So they're also pushing Nintendo on this too, versus Sega, where it's kind of censorship with extra steps.
Okay. So that might seem more obvious, but what I didn't see coming is the truth that the first software ratings board, which is the VRC, was created not to curtail violent video games, but to permit them in some form.
That's a fair observation. It kind of allows a company like Sega to say, okay, we're going to have these levels of content in games, but if you don't want to see them, you now see the rating. If you don't want your 10-year-old kid to get it, don't buy an MA17 rated game. And we'll also see that's kind of where we are now. If you don't want your kid buying an M-rated game, don't buy an M-rated game. It's still kind of the same mentality we have now. And they were pushing that in 1993.
Yeah, to me, it makes sense that would have been something that would be pretty easy to get people's heads around, just because by that point we'd had the movie rating system for years and years. So people in theory were already used to the idea of like, parents, you control whether or not your kid can see an R-rated movie.
We'll actually also say too, so the guys at Sega who developed the VRC initially reached out to the Motion Picture Association of America to try to get the film rating system adapted to video games. And Jack Valenti, who was the head of the MPAA basically said, if you do this, we're going to sue the shit out of you. So they basically just did the MPAA, but like with a different name. So like instead of G, we have GA. Instead of PG-13, we have MA-13. Instead of R, we have MA-17. They basically made a carbon copy of the rating system and just called it a different thing. In addition to Sega and Nintendo's competing measures, several other game companies developed content monitoring systems of their own. Not long after the launch of the Video Game Rating Council at Sega, the 3DO company announced its own letter-based system for games that appeared on its system. It was basically the same thing as the VRC. It was just called a different thing. Others launched campaigns to inform parents about responsible video game play. For example, in 1990, Konami introduced a new corporate representative for consumers called the Konami Mom, also known as Charlene Robinson, who was a child psychologist from Chicago, who on behalf of Konami conducted speaking engagements on responsible video game play. The company also offered an informational pamphlet on responsible play. 2 years later, in late 1992, Hudson Soft, who was both a Nintendo licensee and also a big software contributor for the TurboGrafx-6 team, put out their own pamphlet called 10 Tips for Responsible Play, which they offered both in stores and by mail order. If you actually bought a Hudson Soft video game, the manual would have a thing in the back of it where you could order this pamphlet. And 10 Tips starred Hudson mascot Master Higgins of Adventure Island fame as he walked parents through responsible gaming habits, including reviewing content and setting gameplay boundaries for children. And again, another call to our listeners. I actually reach out again to the International Center for the History of Electronic Games. If they had a copy of this pamphlet, they don't. So if you have a copy lying around somewhere, let me know. scandalousgamespodcast@gmail.com.
I also, real quick, Kevin, have a quick message to our listeners. Can we all just agree that instead of Konami Mom, Komami is like the obvious better name for this character?
Love it.
I agree with that. Seconded.
I mean, I guess I can see why if you're trying, Komami sounds like I'm the person to tell you about video games for 3 and 4 year olds, I guess. But
she's a smart woman who realized a good way to make money was to develop a consultant business and found a target audience of people who needed help understanding how to parent their children.
But you know what, though? I mean, I feel like that's the lament of all parents is that, wait, this kid didn't come with an instruction manual. So
Komami, please come help.
I want my Komami.
Some companies also implemented crude parental controls for their games. So, for example, if you want to play Voyeur, which is a 1993 CDI game, which is basically Night Trap, except it actually does have sex scenes and swearing, you had to enter a 4-digit code when you booted up the game. Pro tip for CDI collectors out there, that code is 3333. Yeah, the same code you put on your luggage is the parental control for Voyeur. Others had parental advisory messages on their packaging. For example, Technocop, which was a game released in 1990 for the Genesis, came with a parental advisory on the box warning, quote, "Attention, scenes depicted can be of a violent nature, not intended for those under 12 years of age," end quote. Speaking of Night Trap also came with a parental advisory, albeit in really tiny font on the front of the package, cautioning, quote, "Content advisory may not be suitable for young children," end quote. You can't say they didn't try at Digital Pictures. On the other hand, some game developers tried to sneak by as much raunchy content as they could get away with. Take Naughty Dog as an example. In 1992, the future makers of The Last of Us released a fantasy RPG for the Sega Genesis called Rings of Power. Now, playing Rings of Power is kind of a mixed bag. It has an ambitious open world design and some pretty good music, in my opinion, although it has a convoluted menu and, in my opinion, an awful combat system. But notable for our discussion, if a player plugged in a second controller into their Genesis and held the A, B, C, and start buttons while pressing down right on the D-pad as they booted up the Genesis with Rings of Power inserted, they were treated to an opening sequence involving a topless woman. Before Hot Coffee, there was Naughty Dog inserting a nude character into their game. Also, this was not hard to find in the game magazines at the time.
Man, Kevin, I really expected more from Naughty Dog Software.
You could also make the argument that in hiding away the graphic content from the Sega Genesis version of Mortal Kombat with the cheat code, Acclaim, with at the very least tacit approval from Sega, was undermining the integrity of the VRC. Like, I think they knew that the people who were going to be playing Mortal Kombat were teenagers, and they were going to find a way to do it, and they just kind of hid away the blood code in kind of a cheeky way. So you could make the argument that kind of renders the VRC kind of meaningless if they're going to do that kind of stuff in favor of games that are going to sell really well. So in that respect, you can see what Nintendo was talking about in terms of like a smokescreen for more violent content.
So how was the existence of these Easter eggs taken when they came to light? Or did they come to mainstream light? Was it a scandal or was it fairly benign?
That's a good question. I'm not really sure how Sega handled this, but as far as I know, Rings of Power just slid under the radar.
I never heard of Rings of Power before today.
1993 was also not the first time people called for games to be rated. Several media watchdog groups with names like Parents Against Video Violence and the National Coalition on Television Violence, more on those dudes in a minute, push for lawmakers to impose some kind of parental controls or warnings on games as far back as 1990. There were also some in the industry, such as Ken Williams of Sierra, calling for games to be rated as far back as the late 80s or early 1990s. So this was a conversation that was happening. But like what I mentioned last time, I think what happened with 1993 is kind of all the pieces fit together, where it was the push for this kind of thing, and also the panic over media violence happened, in addition to stuff like, Mortal Kombat's popularity and CD games coming up. So all this stuff was kind of coming together, and finally this issue would have been kind of been bounced around for a bunch, was now becoming relevant. And all that leads us finally to that congressional hearing on December the 9th, 1993. Leading the proceedings was Joe Lieberman, as well as a U.S. Senator from Wisconsin by the name of Herb Kohl. Kohl was a fellow Democrat who, incidentally, like Joe Lieberman, was also looking at re-election in 1994. And this particular freshman senator also had a long background in business. You hear that name Kohl, he was the former head of Kohl's department stores. And at the time of the hearing, he was the owner of the Milwaukee Bucks.
Huh.
Wow.
Also joining Joe Lieberman and Herb Kohl was a guy named Byron Dorgan, who was a Democratic senator from North Dakota, who was less interesting than Kohl and Lieberman, aside from the fact that I am convinced he did zero research before he did this hearing. I'm absolutely convinced that someone told him about this as he was walking to this hearing, because he has all the moral outrage of someone who did not do the assignment. So calling the hearing to order, both Lieberman and Kohl reminded attendees, as well as I'm certain the legions of people watching C-SPAN on a Thursday morning, of the stakes of tackling video game violence. Lieberman ran through a list of recent high-profile crimes making their way through the news, which we talked about in our previous episode, so go check that out, asserting that those kinds of things demonstrate a need to crack down on video game content, saying, quote, "Every day, the news brings more and more images of random violence, torture, and sexual aggression right into our living rooms. Just this week, the dreadful story of the young girl abducted from a slumber party in her own home and then found killed. A man on a commuter train begins coldly and methodically to fire away at innocents on their way home, killing 5 people and injuring many others. Violence and violent images permeate more and more aspects of our lives, and I think it's time to draw the line. I know that at one place parents want us to draw the line. It's with violence in video games. The fact is that a new generation of video games crosses that line, containing the most horrible depictions of graphic violence and sex, including particularly violence against women. Like the Grinch who stole Christmas, these violent video games threaten to rob this particular holiday season of a spirit of goodwill. Instead of enriching a child's mind, these games teach a child to enjoy inflicting torture," end quote. Herbert Kohl also added that there was a direct link between violent video games and real-world violence, and warned that as the tech got better, the negative effects of games would get worse, saying, quote, "We all know that there are many causes of the violence that plagues our cities and increasingly our suburbs and our small towns. Broken families, poor education, easy access to firearms, drugs, the list goes on. Certainly playing violent video games and TV violence have become a significant part, but we cannot become paralyzed by the multiplicity of causes or the magnitude of the challenge. We need to make every effort to reduce this culture of carnage, and we need to make that effort now, because with interactive technology and virtual reality, these games are going to become even more sophisticated and persuasive," end quote. And for more on the panic over crime and why Kohl may have been overstating just a bit, check out our previous episode on Mortal Kombat and the violent crime panic.
I love the way he said that, because he basically took all of the important aspects of the human existence that contribute to crime and kind of bottled them up, stuck video games next to them, and said, hey, hold on, we need to focus. We could kick all this out of the way and focus on video games right now, because this is simple and easy. It was like beautiful oratory.
I know that access to firearms might have something also to do with violent crime. We'll form a committee at some point in the coming decades to talk about that. But right now, what parents need us to discuss is violence in video games.
It's that fucking Rings of Power. We need to stop it.
Let's not let all those other things distract us. Let's focus. We need to crack down on video games.
It does seem like a really successful play that you can make decade after decade after decade if this podcast has taught me anything.
Joining the senators were two sets of panelists. The first panel consisted of 4 representatives from the educational, media activist, and academic communities. Now, 2 of these panels are not terribly exciting, so I'm not going to devote a huge amount of attention to those. Are Robert Chase, who was the vice president of the Connecticut branch of the National Education Association, basically the largest teachers union. The other guy was Parker Page, who was the founder and head of the Children's Television Research and Education Center, which was a media watchdog group that was based in San Francisco. Now, Page and Chase basically filled in the role of people who argue that the research shows that video games are harmful. They basically argued that research on TV violence proved exposure to violent images on TV had negative effects on children. And while there was little evidence proving this, stood to reason that violent video games had similar impact on young minds, if not more so than TV, because they were interactive. Now, I'm not going to devote a huge amount of time to dissecting this argument today because we already did an episode on that. So feel free to check out our episode on violent video game research for why I have issues with what they just said. But joining Parker Page and Robert Chase were 2, let's say, more colorful characters. Those were Eugene Provenzo and Marilyn Droz. Let's start with Eugene Provenzo. And Eugene Provenzo, since 1976, was professor in the Department of Teaching and Learning at the University of Miami. Now, odds are the reason he was invited to testify was that in 1991, he had published a book called Video Kids Making Sense of Nintendo, where he examined the content of popular NES titles and concluded that video games were overwhelmingly violent, sexist, and racist. Now, I'm not going to devote a huge amount of attention to Video Kids, but I will say I've read a lot of academic works in my time, and Video Kids has to be one of the shallowest, laziest books I've ever read. Provenzo makes some really bold claims. He says video games are overwhelmingly violent, sexist, and racist, but those are claims he doesn't explore in any meaningful depth. So, for example, saying video games are sexist. Video games have a lot of damsels in distress. End of book. That's it. In fact, he does no analysis on racism in video games, despite claiming that video games are racist, aside from the fact that he says that video games are xenophobic because some of them have ninjas in them. Even when he does talk about violence and sexism, it's really surface level. And I will tell you this, it's not like he was hurting for space, because taking away notes, his book is less than 140 pages long, which is pathetically short by academic standards. He also complains that video games limit a child's creativity because they have to follow a set of rules in order to win. But I'm pretty sure that's how games work in general. On top of that, his book is also rife with factual errors. For example, he constantly mentions a game system called the Activision, which is a game system that doesn't fucking exist. He's also one of those people who refers to all video games as Nintendos, which is personally a pet peeve of mine. Now, I'm a failed academic, so I'm prone to pettiness, and so all of this may sound petty, but I'm not the only one who felt this way about Video Kids. For example, a reviewer of his book in the November 1992 edition of Contemporary Sociology wrote, quote, "Provenzo is well-meaning, but his arguments are so devoid of subtlety and grounding as to make his volume read like an extended graduate student paper," end quote, which ouch for grad school. Now, nevertheless, Provenzo did attract press attention, and several reporters approached him for sound bites as the discussion over video game violence became more newsworthy. Now, were I to speculate, he may have rushed out the book for just this reason, to be considered an expert in the field who would get attention from lawmakers and the press. That's only my opinion. I think that's what he did.
So, Kevin, was Video Kids influential?
I mean, it was influential in the sense that newspaper reporters like to talk to Eugene Provenzo about video game violence. But as far as I can tell, it made no impact in the academic community. And what did Dr. Provenzo have to say about video games to lawmakers? Well, aside from reasserting the points he allegedly made in his hilariously short book, he also warned Joe Lieberman and Herb Cole that the real threat was not just the likes of Mortal Kombat and Night Trap, but the VR and CD-ROM-based games of the future, which he viewed as a completely new form of entertainment, one he likened to the Feelies from Aldous Huxley's 1932 dystopian novel Brave New World. Now, are we all familiar with the Feelies?
Never read Brave New World.
I read it years and years ago. It's basically like you're going to watch a movie, but you're doing something that it's like feeding sensory input into you as well, basically, right?
So yeah, the feelies is basically this idea of like a fully sensory immersive film experience. So like all the feelings that are happening in the movie happen to you. As a result of that, a lot of the feelings are really sex oriented. He warned that video games were going to be like that eventually if VR got to a point that it was advanced enough, that all the pain and the pleasure and everything that's happening in a video game is going to happen to you. And he thought that it was a bad thing. I will also talk about along the way, he name dropped the iPhone, the Data Glove, and Teledildonics, our old friend Teledildonics, as evidence that parents should be concerned about the future of video games. At one point, he even warned that interactive media are creating like these new fighting experiences. So you remember the Sega Activator? He actually talked about the Activator and punched the air while he was talking about it to legislators. Like Page and Chase, Provenzel also leaned on research claiming there was a link between TV violence and aggression, including citing an absolutely bonkers 1992 article from the Journal of the American Medical Association that claimed that television was responsible for half the murders in the United States. Rounding out the first panel was Marilyn Droz. Now, Marilyn Droz was the vice president of the National Coalition on Television Violence, that group I mentioned a few minutes ago who was advocating for video game ratings for a while. Now, we're not going to talk too much about Marilyn Droz. Instead, we're going to talk about NCTV, and more specifically, its founder, a guy named Thomas Radecki. Thomas Radecki was an Illinois psychiatrist who founded the National Coalition for Television Violence in 1980. As the name suggests, his goal was to raise awareness of TV violence, and Radecki was convinced that there was a direct relationship between TV violence and violent crime, at one point arguing that in keeping violent programming on the air, quote, "we are taking a serious chance of causing the end of the world," end quote.
That's a whole lot.
I appreciate him not understanding his thoughts on TV violence.
Look, I don't want to pull any punches on this. Wait, except I do, because violence could end the world. No!
Maniacs! We blew it up! Why did we have to have He-Man? So therefore, Tom Radecki took it upon himself to monitor how many acts of violence appeared per hour in a given block of television, and then pressure networks and lawmakers to reduce their numbers of violent acts. I will point out, however, that Tom Radecki had a really broad criteria for what was considered an instance of violence on television. By his metric, that included everything from someone getting hit in the face with a pie to someone getting shot execution style. As an aside, he and the National Coalition for Television Violence, along with a private investigator / occult expert named Patricia Pulling, were key players in a wild moral crusade against Dungeons and Dragons in the 1980s, which may be a future episode. Now, you might be wondering why NCTV sent Marilyn Droz instead of Tom Radecki. And his absence probably had a lot to do with the fact that he'd been ousted from the group in 1992 on account of some ethical lapses. And by ethical lapses, I mean he was fucking his patients. On March the 31st, 1992, the Illinois Department of Professional Regulation found that Thomas Radecki had engaged in what they called, quote, immoral conduct of an unprofessional nature with a patient, end quote, and suspended his medical license for 5 years.
Wow.
In fact, it's worth briefly mentioning what Thomas Radecki is up to these days. As of this recording, the former doctor and defender of moral virtue is a resident of Pennsylvania's State Correctional Institution at Mercer.
Oh, wow.
During the 2000s, Radecki had operated a set of drug treatment facilities where he used his position to coerce female patients into having sex with him in exchange for drugs. Yeah, real paragon of virtue, Thomas Radecki.
If only he'd known the code to unlock the nudity in Rings of Power, he wouldn't have needed to cross those lines.
Wow, that's a really good point. The makers of that game were trying to save us from even greater evils.
On June the 1st, 2016, a Clarion County, Pennsylvania judge sentenced him to 11 to 22 years in prison.
That's a pretty major crime he committed.
Yeah, isn't it funny how he's pushing for, moral values and stuff, and he was doing that kind of stuff.
Yeah, isn't that like an elected member of Congress, like being a drug runner or something?
Oh! Yes.
Hi-yo.
We'll always bring this back to moral crusader / gun runner Leland Yee.
This episode's like the last episode of Seinfeld. We're just doing like all the callbacks on the previous episodes of this podcast.
I will say Marilyn Drose, meanwhile, is significantly less exciting than her former boss. She was a longtime educator. And I will even say that I kind of agree with some of her testimony. So, for example, I believe she rightly pointed out that video game content played a role in a growing interest gap between boys and girls. And this helped contribute to a gender gap in the computer and tech fields, which is something the industry is still grappling with to this day. So it's actually some reasonable things that Marilyn Drose is talking about. But as you can guess from this lineup, none of the assembled panelists had many positive things to say about video games. And this largely served to reinforce Joe Lieberman and Delott's preconceived notions about the dangerous effects of video games. And both the panelists and the senators warned that video games had come a long way from Pac-Man and Space Invaders, in the sense that video games like Mortal Kombat either desensitized children to violence or reinforced that violence was a viable problem-solving option. Or as Senator Slade Gordon put in a prepared statement, quote, "Wake up, Mom and Dad, this isn't Pac-Man anymore. Pac-Man and Pong have been replaced by Mortal Kombat and Night Trap, games that glorify violence and show our darkest nightmares on video screens," end quote. On top of that, they warned that with the holodeck, teledildonics, and the other lofty promises made by guys like Jaron Lanier, Timothy Leary, and Tom Zito, allegedly only a few years away, they needed to nip video game violence in the bud before, young Billy put on a data glove and ripped out his little sister's spine, or God forbid, saw a digitized boob or whatever. And for all of them, there was no greater threat to the moral order of society than Night Trap. I'm not going to devote a huge amount of time to Night Trap's particulars, so I recommend you check out our previous episode on it. Byron Dorgan, whom I'm convinced first heard about Night Trap when he walked into the hearing that day, called it, quote, "a sick and disgusting video game," end quote, whose objective was, quote, "to trap and kill women," end quote, and described the act of playing the game as child abuse in and of itself. Marilyn Drose rhetorically asked, quote, "How would you like to have a teenage daughter go on a date with someone who has just watched or played 3 hours of that game," end quote. Eugene Provenzo, demonstrating the level of depth on display in Video Kids, said, quote, "For a child playing Sega's Night Trap, this fantasy world includes torturing women with machines and murdering women so their blood can be sucked and decanted into wine bottles," end quote. No, it fucking doesn't. And both Herb Cole and Joe Lieberman called for Night Trap to be banned. And that's pretty impressive for a game with, to put it mildly, limited exposure prior to this hearing. At this point, Night Trap was only out for the Sega CD. It's an expensive add-on for the Sega Genesis. And that game, according to reports, may have sold about 100,000 copies since its release in October 1992, more than a year before the hearing started. By comparison, between September and December 1993, Acclaim sold roughly 4 million copies of the home versions of Mortal Kombat, to say nothing of the fact that it was the hottest arcade game at that time. But no, Night Trap was the bigger threat. Now, to be fair, Night Trap is a CD-ROM game with live actors, some of whom were young women in nightgowns, epitomize all of their moralist fears, both about the corrupting influence of video games and the dangerous future potential of tech like CD-ROM and FMV games. Now, on top of that, it probably helped that Night Trap was obscure because it allowed guys like Joe Lieberman to control the narrative and shape the game as something that it morally transgressed beyond any level of redemption. Because how many people could actually counter those claims? How many people are actually playing Night Trap? And I will say, skipping ahead, this ended up working pretty well for Digital Pictures, the guys that made Night Trap. And going forward, the publicity allowed them to market Night Trap as the game even Congress doesn't want you to play. So that's our first panel. Any other thoughts before we move on?
I don't know. It just feels like Congress from 25 years ago just feels a lot like Congress of today.
God damn, it's depressing. Rounding out the hearing was a panel of representatives from the video game industry. There were 5 attendees in this panel, but 3 of them were at the best tangentially related to video games. These were Eileen Rosenthal, who was the senior counsel of the Software Publishers Association, which was the lobbying and professional organization for computer software in general. Like everything that appeared on a computer could count under the Software Publishers Association. Then there was Dawn Weiner, who was the president of the Video Software Dealers Association. And this is an organization that represents rental organizations. So places where you like rent movies and video games. And then you had Craig Johnson, who up until before the hearing was the head of the Amusement and Music Operators Association, the AMOA, which is for people and companies that rent arcade games. So like arcades or like anywhere you see an arcade game, they cover those people who put them in their places. And they do everything from like jukeboxes to any coin-operated amusements to video games. And the only reason I bring them up is to reassert that at the time, the video games industry had no dedicated trade organization for video games specifically. way, and at the time were kind of just glommed onto a bunch of other trade organizations. There's really no group that's really thinking directly about video games, and they're kind of just attached to these other ancillary groups. That's going to be important in a little bit. But joining them, the other two representatives were from Nintendo and Sega, the two biggest console manufacturers in the US in 1993. Representing Nintendo of America was the company's vice president, a dude named Howard Lincoln. Lincoln was a longtime attorney before taking over as an executive at Nintendo. And another fun fact about Howard Lincoln, in 1956, he was a Boy Scout when he was a kid, and he posed for a Norman Rockwell painting called The Scoutmaster. Representing Sega America was a guy named Bill White. Bill White was a relatively young guy, and interestingly enough, he was a former Nintendo dude. He was Nintendo's director of advertising and public relations, and he left Nintendo for Sega to be their vice president of marketing. And so both of these guys are the representatives of their respective companies at the hearings. Now, before I talk about how Lincoln and White handled this hearing, I'm going to present you all with three options. Now, you're a representative of Nintendo or Sega. You're going to be brought before Congress to answer for your content and its impact on the moral fabric of society, with a real threat that if you screw this up, the federal government will regulate your content for you. What do? Do you A, put aside your marketing feud and develop a coordinated plan to respond to lawmakers? B, preemptively adopt a universal rating system for use across all companies in the games industry and use the hearing as an opportunity to give lawmakers a rundown of your plan? Or C, do everything in your power to prop up your corporate image while throwing your competitor under the bus? What do you think?
Definitely B. It sounds like the most reasonable option.
I'm just trying to think what Nintendo don't do, because I'm feeling like that's what Sega would do. I mean, given that the title of this series is Scandalous Games and not Times Where People Always Made Great Choices, I'm going to assume it's C. That's my guess.
So I know that the answer is, it's always C on this podcast, right? But if the question is what I would have done, I probably also would have done C.
Wait, the answer is always C? Kevin, are you giving these guys the answer?
Now, longtime listeners of this show will know that whenever I offer three choice lines, the answer is always C. Lincoln and White fought like they were on the Titanic, and there was only one seat left on the lifeboats, with each rep doing everything they could to make the other look bad. I will point out before I talk about what happened, it didn't have to be this way, because leading up to the hearing, the folks at Sega actually tried to do both A and B. So prior to the December 9th hearing, Sega of America president Tom Kalinske sent a letter to Minoru Arakawa, who was his counterpart at Nintendo of America, encouraging collaboration between the two companies on either implementing the Video Game Rating Council, again, that was Sega's system, on an industry-wide scale, or developing an entirely new system that both companies would adopt. However, Nintendo of America ignored Sega's calls for cooperation. Sega also tried to get ahead of the congressional hearing by rolling out the VRC on an industry scale. And on December the 9th, 1993, several hours before the hearing convened, Sega announced it had reached an agreement with 140 game manufacturers, including other console manufacturers like the 3DO company and Atari, who were making the Jaguar at the time, to adopt the VRC. However, there was one notable holdout: Nintendo. Now, Blake Harris has written the definitive account of the industry side of the panic over violent video games in 1993. According to Blake Harris, Nintendo executives largely blame Sega for putting the industry in this mess in the first place, basically saying by allowing such permissive things like Mortal Kombat and not ruling their third-party manufacturers with an iron hand and restricting all of their content, that they put this on themselves. And Nintendo basically said, you made your bed, you're going to lie in it.
So from a game theory perspective, I think that kind of makes sense, because if Nintendo's brand is them being squeaky clean, who stands to lose the most from this regulatory board having domain over both of these companies? Clearly, Sega does. So one, I have very little to fear because part of my brand is to be compliant with the spirit of this board anyway. So if I'm going to have to abide by these things anyway, if we all are, what's the most use I can get out of my stage time? I'm going to shit talk my competitor as much as I can. So even though C usually doesn't make sense, I kind of think in an insidious way, this does kind of make sense.
Yeah, Nintendo basically takes the stance of you're the reason we are before Congress in the first place. So we have no interest in working with you, is effectively what they're saying.
So in this case, Sega really did do what Nintendo didn't. Sounds like.
Sega did with Nintendo, and Nintendo's going to make them pay for it. As a result, Howard Lincoln and Bill White's time before Congress rapidly devolved into each asserting how much they were doing to protect America's children while shitting over whatever measures the other company had in place. Lincoln leaned on Nintendo's internal content guidelines, asserting they put measures in place to keep the most objectionable content out of the hands of children, saying that that was something that Sega failed to do. Meanwhile, Bill White at Sega pointed to the Video Game Rating Council as a system designed to help parents make informed purchases. He also made it clear that Sega published games that cater to older demographics than just young children, so older audiences than Nintendo was for. White also showed footage from the Super NES version of Street Fighter II at the hearing to show that Nintendo, despite their content restrictions, had games with similar levels of violence to what appeared on Sega systems. So effectively saying that we have the same kind of content in these types of games, but ours has actually a rating to inform parents. However, I will point out that Bill White, in being the representative of the company that dared to allow the hated Night Trap onto one of its systems, found himself in a virtually indefensible position. Lieberman repeatedly drilled him on why Sega allowed Night Trap on the market. He tried to get White to admit that Sega allowed irresponsible advertising practices from his licensees and even accused Sega of marketing Mortal Kombat directly to children. In the middle of one of White's responses to this, Lieberman actually just cut him off, declaring, quote, "You're going to have to go a long way to convince me that you're raising anyone's values or reducing anyone's inclination toward aggression, and particularly aggression toward women, by putting this on the market," end quote. Byron Dorgan, showing the enthusiasm of someone who didn't read the assignment and is figuring out what everyone else is talking about from context clues, chastised White for the labeling of the MA-13 rating because he argued 13-year-olds weren't mature. He literally said, "You're calling this mature? 13-year-olds aren't mature. What's wrong with you?"
And furthermore, how could someone even trap the night itself? It doesn't make any sense.
Wait a minute. You have a problem with the age 13? All we're doing is what the MPAA does. We didn't copy the MPAA over this at all. Next question.
And you better believe that Howard Lincoln was not above joining in on the Night Trap dogpile, explaining numerous times how Night Trap did not and would not appear on a Nintendo system, conveniently leaving out the fact that Nintendo did not have a system capable of running it. And as an aside, thanks to their ardent resistance to CD-based hardware, would not have a system capable of running Night Trap for at least another 8 years. Lincoln, sensing blood in the water, even saw an opportunity to accuse White, whom I should point out was not only a professional colleague of Howard Lincoln's, but a former co-worker, of lying to Congress. After White explained that the average Genesis user was 19 years old and the average Sega CD user was 22 years old, Lincoln shot back saying, quote, "I can't sit here and allow you to be told that somehow the video game business has been transformed today from kids to adults. It hasn't been. And Mr. White, who is a former Nintendo employee, knows the demographic as well as I do. Furthermore, I can't let you sit here and buy this nonsense that this Sega Night Trap game was somehow only meant for adults," end quote.
Listen, back when we were coworkers, we would go out for drinks now and then, and Bill White would just, get a drink or two in him. He just wouldn't shut up about how he couldn't wait to lie to Congress someday. I mean, I don't know if that's relevant here. I'm just going to say it.
Now, I don't know if this was Nintendo's intention, but the panic over video games allowed the Big N to spin a couple of notable business failures into an air of corporate responsibility. It was no mystery. You mentioned this before, Phil, that the Genesis version of Mortal Kombat, thanks in part to the blood code, vastly outsold the stripped-down Super NES port. Lincoln used that to tell lawmakers that showed Nintendo was willing to protect children from violent video games, even at the expense of their own profits. What a spin.
How kind of
that is good work. I mean, you gotta, is that artful?
Yeah, it's a masterstroke right there. Meanwhile, one positive to come out of Nintendo's several failed deals to make a CD-ROM based system, one of which resulted in the creation of the Sony PlayStation, mind you, was a good thing because it meant they didn't have a system capable of playing the hated Night Trap. All of this allowed Nintendo to seize the moral high ground and use the obscure FMV game as a cudgel to beat down Sega and its rating system. And I will say, in throwing Bill White and Sega under the bus at every turn, Howard Lincoln successfully deflected most of the criticism away from Nintendo to the point that Lieberman told him, quote, "I believe you've shown some leadership here. You're not perfect, but you've been a damn sight better than the competition," end quote. White, on the other hand, tried to stick to his talking points. However, the constant barrage from both the senators and Lincoln clearly got to him. Near the end of the hearing, White tried to land what he thought was a killing blow on Nintendo, thanks to some visual aids. He reached under his chair and put on the desk in front of him the Super Scope. Are you all familiar with the Super Scope?
It was the Super NES's version of the light gun, basically, but you wielded it, I think, sort of like a bazooka. There was an eyepiece and you held it kind of on your shoulder.
Yeah. So he pulls out under his chair the Super Scope to show to Congress. And he said the following, quote, "I might also point out that Sega produces product for a rapid fire machine gun with several games available, and they have no rating on that product to suggest that that product is for adults," end quote. Now, in case you missed that, in his haste to show up Nintendo, White accidentally said that Sega, not Nintendo, made the Super Scope.
You got to feel for him.
How did he get something that looks like a bazooka before Congress?
I snuck it in.
Hey, man, this was pre 9/11. Nobody cared.
Oh, Jesus Christ. Oh, my God.
It seems like pre-January 6th, you can get about anything.
Dude, all those Jan 6ers rushing to Congress with their Super Scopes. When asked for comment, Howard Lincoln jokingly replied, quote, "I think that this device is for target shooting and whatnot," end quote, which did get some laughter from both the lawmakers and the attendees. All of this is to say that the industry did not exactly put its best face forward when staring down the barrel of federal regulation. And I hate to sound like a Monday morning quarterback, but it didn't have to be this way. And I offered two examples of how it could have potentially gone down. So in the 80s, facing criticism that video games were responsible from everything from delinquency to addiction to wrist pain, Atari waged a series of PR campaigns emphasizing the positive aspects of video games. In 1981, they actually founded a research think tank called the Atari Institute for Educational Action, which supported research highlighting the positive aspects of video games. In May of 1983, they even sponsored a symposium on the topic at Harvard University's Graduate School of Education called Video Games and Human Development, a Research Agenda for the 80s. So they could have done that. And as another example, around the same time during the crime panic, on February the 23rd, 1994, lawmakers tried to give rap music a similar treatment, arguing that gangster rap promoted violence and misogyny. However, the recording industry delivered an organized, unified response, including sending experts that contested those claims and emphasized the importance of rap music in communities of color. Now, Nintendo and Sega could have sent one representative to represent both of them, or brought forth their own experts to contest the likes of Parker Page and Eugene Provenzo. Hell, Lincoln and White could have at least collaborated. They could have shared notes. They could have presented a unified message in defense of their common industry. They're both on the same team with this. But no, Nintendo and Sega, in their determined quest to dunk on each other, offered no meaningful defense of their industry or their medium, and effectively conceded the entire argument that video games were harmful to children.
So let me just ask you, based on that, what do you think the impact would have been if they had done that?
That's a good question. Part of me thinks that this would have happened the same way just because video games had no meaningful defense or representation in Congress. It is an educational example looking at what the music industry has done in response to these claims. So like I just mentioned that gangster rap here in 94, that was not the first time that the music industry had to do this. In the mid 80s, there was a congressional hearing about violence and sex in music. And one of the things that the industry did is they sent experts, including Dee Snider of Twisted Sister. Dee Snider basically, I'm a parent and I look at my lyrics and I understand what my lyrics are for. And these are the things that the impact impact is. Like, I've had people who have been victims of drug abuse, and I've had people who are victims of suicide and stuff. The music didn't do that. It was a whole bunch of other shit that did that. And really taking on this question about, does music actually cause these things? It's like, dude, it's all these other things that are causing that. Music is an escape from all that. So, like, on one hand, they could have done that. I mean, on the other hand, you could also argue that the public perception, thanks in no small part to Nintendo, was that video games were kid stuff and this was going to happen anyway. And that it's possible that nothing would have changed regarding that. But I mean, it's not a great thing where, like, I mean, imagine, again, using music industry as an example, imagine like Capitol Records and like Def Jam Records, if they're both sending their own representatives and say the other guy sucks and we know what we're talking about. It's a completely different argument because it's completely conceding the point that that medium is harmful by doing this petty infighting. And maybe they could have gotten ahead of this by doing a rating system in advance. And Nintendo was having none of that. Now, there's also some arguments that Nintendo dropped the dime on Sega. Nintendo knew that they were getting outsold by Sega on Mortal Kombat. And there's some people that argue, Blake Harris is one of them, that Nintendo sent selective footage of Night Trap to Joe Lieberman so he would get upset about Night Trap and he would target Sega. And that all of this was a PR move by Nintendo to get a blow against Sega and get revenge for Sega selling better on Mortal Kombat.
It's like the cynic in me. I really dig that angle because think about it. If Columbia Records only distributed Christian music, do you think they would have partnered with any of the other big record labels to offer a defense of why it's important for music, lyrics, and content to not be censored? So, like, thinking about these two parties, if they both realized, you know what, there's no way we're going to get out of this type of regulation, yeah, I would use that as an opportunity to shit talk the other guy.
Definitely sounds reasonable.
Clips of Mortal Kombat and Night Trap flooded the news media in the weeks that followed the hearings. Speaking personally, as a kid during this time, the first time I ever heard of Night Trap was when it appeared on World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. That's how I found out about Night Trap. So that will tell you about the level of exposure this thing gave to a game like Night Trap. I would have never known about this game otherwise.
They really got to take a page out of Running with Scissors book, except maybe like for real instead of just what Running with Scissors always pretended was the
except being actually successful.
Yeah.
Amazed you watched World News Tonight when you were a kid.
When this happened, I was 9 years old. I watched whatever my parents were watching, and they watched World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. The hearing also gave more than a few pundits a chance to air out their moral outrage. So, for example, here's how Roger Simon of the Baltimore Sun described Night Trap to readers in an article published the day after the hearing. Quote, Sega of America thinks because it sticks a warning label on Night Trap saying it's for consumers 17 and older, and Sega did this only after public outcry. Parenthetically, that's not true. That Night Trap is okay. Night Trap is not okay. And it has little to do with whether it can be proved beyond a reasonable doubt that violent videos lead to violence by children. Night Trap is simply repellent garbage. And if Night Trap is just plain garbage, what does that make the people who buy it? End quote. Yikes, Baltimore Sun. Oh yeah, speaking of strong words from people who definitely had never heard of Night Trap until Joe Lieberman played tape of a footage from in DC, we have this editorial from the December 12th, 1993 edition of the Philadelphia Inquirer, which offered some, let's say, creative responses to video game violence. Quote, the industry last week volunteered to a rating system patterned on the motion picture industry's 20-year system when Congress threatened to lower the boom. But why not keep the purveyors of video violence sweating? With all these new technologies, we're sure that the worst offenders could be offered a choice. Confiscatory tax rates, or a few weeks in a Clockwork Orange-style anti-violence rig watching without blinking endless films of hideous brutality, end quote. Way to go, Philadelphia Inquirer. Other people use the moral panic over video games to score some easy PR points. And some of this will sound familiar from our Postal episode. For example, a number of major retailers practically tripped over themselves to pull Night Trap. In the weeks following the hearing, Toys R Us, KB Toys, and FAO Schwartz all announced that they would no longer carry Night Trap. I'm sure it had nothing to do with the fact that the niche Sega CD game was not a terribly great seller. And I'm sure the reason they kept selling Mortal Kombat, which at that point had sold about 40 times as many copies as Night Trap, was because the game's depictions of ripped out hearts and spinal columns provided valuable instruction in human anatomy, and not because retailers were making money off them hand over fist. Now, Nintendo and Sega, meanwhile, despite tripping over their own dicks in front of Congress and facing the possibility of a federally mandated rating system, still refused to work with each other. On January the 6th, 1994, representatives from both companies met at the Winter Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas to discuss the industry's next course of action. A meeting that, according to Console Wars author Blake Harris, mostly devolved into a profanity-laden shouting match with Sega reps trying to convince Nintendo to adopt their rating system, and Nintendo reps basically tell them to go fuck themselves. Howard Lincoln, who came out of the hearing with a promotion to co-head of Nintendo of America, felt compelled to rub more salt in the wound at Sega's poor showing in Washington, putting out a press release directed at Sega of America head Tom Kalinske that read the following, quote, "Dear Tom, roses are red, violets are blue. So you had a bad day. Boo hoo hoo. All my best, Howard," end quote.
Wow, that's like surprisingly petty. It's weird just thinking how, I mean, as a kid, I remember it seemed like a heated debate among kids, like, oh, which console is better? But it's just so weird that it was like 1,000 times like more personal and mean for the adults who actually worked at the companies.
There's probably some type of Greek tragedy angle here about how, they purvey kids' toys and themselves are completely immature. There's some kind of there.
Yeah, and I will point out that there were people who were called later, and Blake Harris has a really good oral history of the ESRB, which I will put in the description of this episode because it's really good. That there were some people who were in the games industry who basically wanted to go to Congress and say, who gives a shit? And like, this is bullshit. And like, we shouldn't have to listen to you guys. And so there was kind of like an edgy, like outsider kind of perspective and a lot of game developers and a lot of game executives that we shouldn't have to listen what Joe Lieberman and Herb Cole have to say anyway. But at the same point, you're also seeing guys like Nintendo saying like, we're going to use this as a PR thing. I mean, Sega's doing that too. It's just Nintendo did better. And I will say, from the game journalism standpoint, a lot of the writers at places like GamePro and EGM stood with Sega. They felt that Bill White did a better job of defending the industry and saying, this isn't just for little kids. We should be able to put out different and interesting content. We should not be censored. And like, we should be able to do things for adults. It's not just 8-year-olds who are playing these games, but in the public perception and people like Joe Lieberman, they thought as Nintendo was the one that won the day because they're the ones basically telling them what they want to hear and basically saying that we're restricting all the sorts of content. Like Joe Lieberman, as an aside, said, I would ban all video game content I don't like if it weren't for a fact there's this pesky thing with the First Amendment. Like Joe Lieberman flat out said he would ban video game content if he felt like he had the power to do so. However, a second meeting in Vegas proved a lot more productive. And a lot of that was thanks to a beloved hero in the video game industry, Electronic Arts. EA sweeps in to save the day, specifically EA Vice President Jack Highstand. And Jack Highstand basically said, we need to come together and we need to figure this shit out. Highstand arranged for a committee of representatives for several of the major players in the industry, including Nintendo and Sega, to meet and figure out what to do next. In the meantime, Joe Lieberman followed through on his threat of federal regulation. And on February the 3rd, 1994, Joe Lieberman introduced the Video Game Rating Act into Congress. The bill called for the creation of a 5-person committee appointed by the president to coordinate with the video game industry to develop a rating system for their products. Moreover, it would be this commission's job to determine whether that rating system sufficiently informed parents of a game's potentially objectionable content and to report to the president whether other actions need to be taken to protect kids from, the likes of Mortal Kombat and Night Trap and Voyeur. On March the 4th, 1994, Highstand met before Lieberman and Cole, announcing the industry had developed a 13-point plan to develop a rating system to be in place for the 1994 holiday season. He also announced that the industry was forming its own dedicated trade organization, which is called the Interactive Digital Software Association, and Highstand was the first head of the IDSA. On July the 27th, 1994, Highstand and several other representatives met one more time with lawmakers to introduce them to their new comprehensive rating system called the Entertainment Software Ratings Board, or the ESRB. Here we are. The ESRB was an independent organization specifically composed of people not directly affiliated with the games industry. Before a game's release, companies were required to send footage of a game's most objectionable content to the ESRB offices in New York, where it would be viewed by a 3-person panel who would determine one of 5 letter ratings to assign the game. The original ratings were EC, which was early childhood, recommended for children aged 3 and older, K to A, kids to adults, recommended for ages 6 or adults, T for teen, which is ages 13 and older, M for mature, which is recommended for people ages 17 and older, and AO, which was adults only, limited to ages 18 and older. Now, the rating needed to be prominently displayed on packaging and advertising, as well as the game's physical media, so like cartridges, CDs, things like that. Wherever the game appeared, it had to be there. Each rated title also came with descriptors that gave a general sense of what that rating covered. So, for example, a K to A game might have descriptors like mild animated violence, comic mischief or animated violence. While an M-rated game might have things like animated blood and gore, realistic blood and gore, mature sexual themes, or profanity. In these respects, the ESRB was not terribly different than the Video Game Rating Council that preceded it, because a lot of those ratings corresponded to the VRC ratings. You could say that the K to A is very much the GA rating. The T rating is pretty much the MA13. The M rating is basically the MA17. And on top of that, the guy who headed the Video Game Rating Council, who was a New York educator named Arthur Pober, was the first head of the ESRB. So a lot of parallels to what the VRC was doing. However, I will say it definitely had better teeth, better marketing, and more broad support than the VRC. For example, there were penalties for non-compliance. And just as important, representatives from major retailers like Walmart, Toys R Us, and Babbage's expressed their support for the ESRB, vowing to display ratings in advertising circulars and asserting they would not carry unrated games going forward. On top of that, some stores also committed to not carrying AO-rated games. And for more on that, check out our episode on the Grand Theft Auto San Andreas Hot Coffee mod for more on the response to AO games and retailers. What's also really interesting about the ESRB is that in some respects, it wasn't that different from the measures that were in place before 1994, particularly that it put the onus on parents. Now, you remember I talked about the Konami mom, or the Kamami as we talked about, and 10 Tips for Responsible Play by Hudson Soft, and like talking about having a parent be engaged and understanding what their kids are consuming. That's pretty much how the ESRB is operating, because, the ESRB is only really controlling content at the point of sale. So like if a game is M-rated, it's not, in theory, is not going to let a kid get it. However, once some person who's over the age of 17 buys that game and it goes in a person's house, it's up to personal responsibility then. So in that respect, it's not really that different than what was before, but it creates a more acceptable packaging for that. Game magazines were initially very resistant to rating systems. They talked about them as like a slippery slope towards censorship. But by the time the ESRB is rolled out, places like GamePro and EGM are on board and basically saying things like, you know what, if you don't want your kids to play Mortal Kombat, don't buy them Mortal Kombat kind of stuff. The M rating says it's not for kids. And that's pretty much not just where those magazines are, but kind of where we've been ever since. Also, I will point out, the ESRB also really didn't restrict content. And I would argue, if anything, it made it easier for game companies to put out racier content like Mortal Kombat. Because now, video game companies could specifically cater a game to specific audiences. I believe you talked about this when we talked about the Hot Coffee mod, Phil, that like, it's like a t-shirt. I'm going to wear the size that fits me. If I want a game for my kids, I'll get a K to A rated game. But if I want a game for me as an adult, maybe I'll get an M rated game. And so in some respects, it made it easier.
Well, yeah, that's what's counterintuitive about the creation of the ESRB. It was something that was kind of created to permit violent video games and adult content and not really to censor it. Because without it, none of that content would make it out there at all.
Yeah, and that's kind of what Nintendo's problem was at the beginning. Is like the rating is going to allow this content to be out there. And that's kind of what happened. In fact, journalist Tristan Donovan, who wrote a book in 2010 called Replay, The History of Video Games, summed this up really well. He said, quote, Lieberman's attempt to challenge video game violence failed. If anything, the changes that resulted from his intervention made video game violence more acceptable, as the age rating system would identify violent and controversial games as for adults, not children, helping game publishers defend themselves against future accusations of peddling violence to children. The Senate hearings had actually made it safer for video game developers to create violent games, not harder, end quote. And I think that's really true. And that's a lot of what Sega was trying to do, was trying to emphasize, games are not just for kids, despite what Nintendo is marketing. We need to make it easier to cater to those age groups. Now, the trade-off of that is now we can put more of that content out there. Now, I will say, even Nintendo, for all their posturing about corporate responsibility, they also loosened the reins on their content restrictions with the rollout of the ESRB. For example, in 1994, when Mortal Kombat 2 made its debut on the Super Nintendo, the game came with all the arcade gore intact. Since that came out before the rating was rolled out officially, Nintendo stuck a label on the box that warned it may not be appropriate for players in the age of 17. Going forward, Nintendo's marketing also aged up from the typical 8 to 12 kids range to the teens of the Sega crowd. And for an example of that, I'm going to point to an ad for the 1995 Super NES game Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island, a TV commercial that is, in my opinion, the most incredible ad in the history of video game marketing, which I'm going to show you right now.
Awesome.
When is too much too much? To find out, we crammed everything into Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island. 60 more levels, massive enemies, huge Yoshi tricks, all served up with the latest graphic technology, Morphmation.
No more.
Sure you don't have room for another little bonus level?
Uh-oh.
Super Mario World 2, only on the Super NES. Still the big one.
So in this commercial, you have a guy who's eating. Hard for me to tell exactly what he's eating, and eating is getting larger and larger and larger until he explodes. I feel like this wouldn't pass the sensitivity tests these days.
Yeah, that's a good point. Also, just like, even though when he explodes, it's green, it is still like a surprisingly graphic explosion. Like, it looks very much like, oh, here's something ripping out of his stomach, and you see it flashing on everybody.
Well, keep in mind that in the 90s, all those Nickelodeon shows involving slime were still really big, so maybe the public had the appetite for it.
So I think what probably happened is after their time at Congress, the Nintendo executives started listening to that Wu-Tang song Cream, and they just started moving along with that beat. Remind us, what year was that Congressional hearing?
1993.
And then January 31st of 1994, Wu-Tang releases Cream.
Mm-hmm.
See, there you go.
Mm-hmm.
There you go. They're in Tokyo, they're like, Cream.
All connects.
Yeah. And then Congress was like, yeah, life for a shorty shouldn't be so rough.
I will also point out that the ESRB was far from a perfect system, especially in its early years. For example, in the spring of 1996, a 12-year-old boy walked into a Deptford, New Jersey Toys R Us with no parental supervision and successfully purchased a copy of the Sega Genesis version of Mortal Kombat 3, an M-rated game for ages 17 and up, without anyone stopping him. And the name of that 12-year-old was Kevin Impellizeri. I have it right here.
Oh, there you go.
Oh my God!
In comes the SWAT team.
Nevertheless, the creation of the ESRB satisfied Joe Lieberman. Although he remained adamant that video games companies should self-censor their content, he appeared willing to allow the industry to regulate itself, and he abandoned the Video Game Rating Act. However, as we know, he remained a vocal critic of violent video games for the remainder of his political career, and he continues to live rent-free in the heads of the guys at Running with Scissors. And for more on that, check out our episodes on Postal and Postal 2. Now, while the panic over video games was far from a shining moment in the industry's history, I will say that some companies viewed it as a time for a good laugh. For example, in 1995, Sega released Eternal Champions: Challengers from the Dark Side for the Sega CD, which was a souped-up version of Eternal Champions for the Genesis, with more over-the-top violence as well as new stages and characters. It also included one new combatant whose name was the Senator, who was a clear parody of Joe Lieberman and his fellow lawmakers, and included in his moveset is throwing pieces of paper at opponents labeled bands and holding his opponent upside down and shaking them down for money.
The shaking them down for money angle is kind of interesting.
Yeah, I feel like there's a weird level of like low-key anti-Semitism with that, considering Joe Lieberman.
Oh, interesting. Now, I assumed, and this might be like a blindness of myself being Jewish, but I assumed it was an acknowledgement of the video game industry doesn't have a powerful lobbying arm yet. Whereas if we had the cash for that and they were putting the cash toward you, then this wouldn't have happened.
His character bio makes it very clear that this is an opportunistic fucker who is only doing this because it advances his own personal prestige and makes him money. And of course, he's corrupt.
He kind of looks like Dracula.
You know what he looks like to me? He looks like Jack Thompson.
That's funny. He looks a little like George Washington, too.
That same year, Midway released Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 in the arcades, and one of the new characters Midway added to this game was Classic Sub-Zero, who was effectively Sub-Zero from the original Mortal Kombat, with one fun twist. If you enter the button combination for his head-ripping fatality from the first Mortal Kombat, the screen would cut to black and you'd only hear a disembodied scream. I'll wrap things up by checking up on Night Trap, our public enemy number one in the 1993 Mortal Panic over video games. Now, despite all the denunciations and the bans, Night Trap came out more than okay in all of this. Retailers put it back on shelves after the rollout of the ESRB, which issued it an M rating, and Digital Pictures released new versions of the game for the Sega 32X, the 3DO, and the PC. They also leaned into the controversy. An ad for the PC version displayed the copy printed over an American flag, opening, quote, "Some members of Congress tried to ban Night Trap for being sexist and offensive to women. Hey, they ought to know," end quote. The PC version also came with a documentary on the making of the game. In one segment, Digital Pictures head Tom Zito attributed the game's newfound success to Howard Lincoln making a big deal about it at the hearing, saying, quote, "Howard, I owe all the sales of Night Trap to you," end quote. And that's where we'll end it. Final thoughts.
Well, Phil, are you happy that we finally got to the ESRB?
I didn't think this episode would be able to deliver on the buildup we've been going through over the past few months, but this totally delivered. I think this story had everything.
Yeah, it's funny how, as much as it's easy to say, how people were blowing things out of proportion, or, video games still aren't as realistic as they were sure that they were about to be in 1993. Yeah, when you connect all these dots, it is interesting to see how people were coming from, where they were coming from. Nice job.
So here we actually approached something that as a kid I had no idea was going on, this fighting between Sega and Nintendo. For me, most families had one or the other. You either had a Sega or a Nintendo. And I didn't really know any rhyme or reason for it, but I do remember certain games that I'd play only when people had Segas and certain games Nintendo. I can say I never played Mortal Kombat on Nintendo. And I'm thinking this is probably why. Whereas I was a naive kid, probably other people clued into the fact that they could get a more fuller version of the game on Sega. And so that's where we played it. So this was a great episode.
Being the video game newbie, I guess I think about this in like a historical context and comparing where we're at now to the world we lived in when a lot of this stuff happened. When we were talking about the congressional hearing, I couldn't help but notice how much it reminded me of the big tech CEOs being brought before the Senate a few years ago, most notably Mark Zuckerberg, and Congress being kind of clueless as to, how smartphones worked and what exact policies and procedures were going to be appropriate to talk to these CEOs about. So some of that cluelessness, in some ways, I feel like those things have not changed. As far as Joe Lieberman, there's something really specific, Kevin, that you said that really stood out to me when you said that Joe Lieberman said that the ratings board should be composed of presidential appointees. And then remembering that in 1994, the president was a Democrat, and then linking that with my own cynical view that anytime any position is a presidential appointee, you're giving the president another opportunity to reward someone for doing him a favor. So like in this, people like Joe Lieberman and all of the other players involved are trying to get so many things done that are not really related to protecting the American public from violent video games whatsoever. Sega and Nintendo are trying to go at each other. Joe Lieberman's trying to get reelected and curry favor with the president and all sorts of other stuff.
This may be the most influential controversy that we've covered on this show. So much of what we think about video games today stems from this hearing. The panic and the creation of the entertainment software, it gave developers the freedom to develop games with mature and complex themes that they like to. Like, would we have a BioShock? Would we have a Mass Effect? Would we have a Dark Souls? Were it not for the fact that now we could cater to specific audience in games. There are kind of two ways that the video games industry could have gone in 1993 and 1994. They could have gone the rating system way, like the film industry, which is what they ended up doing. They could have also done what the comics industry did. In the 1950s, there was a big moral panic over comic books, which pushed the idea that comic books were leading to moral decay. And what ended up being created, that was a thing called the Comics Code Authority. And the Comics Code Authority was a very restrictive system that said the content of comic books can only be very, very specific things. It was like good has to prevail over evil. We can't have violent or sexy images. And before that, there were things like horror comics and there were like sex-based comics. And basically comic books got put into little boxes that were only for kids. And that's why so much of what we think of comic books is superheroes, because it was one of the only things that was really allowed in the comics code. But the video game industry, it could have very well been that. It could have been the Nintendo model, which focused on children's entertainment. And it may have eventually evolved out of it like comic books did. And a lot of it involved eventually ignoring and abandoning the Comics Code Authority. Or it could have gone the way that games ended up going, which is more like film industry and creating age-based rating systems so they could cater to specific things. So again, in that respect, it created an opportunity where they could not just creatively expand to specific audiences, but also have the protection to say, if you want your kid playing Dark Souls, don't get them an M-rated game. And that kind of spins out of the parental responsibility, where it could have gone like comics saying, like, we need to restrict comics to only kids.
So you did a callback to the small, medium, large topic we talked about from a couple of episodes ago, how people just pick whatever genre is appropriate for them now in where we are with video games. What I think was helpful for me about this episode is that it gave me some insight into maybe how that came to be, because the ESRB was instituted and it counterintuitively to somebody like me actually permitted more video games to be put on the market. You could do anything so long as it was labeled correctly. I think it was conceivable in the 90s you might be able to play every video game that's out there. Not today. So kids have to pick and choose what video games they're going to play. And what are they going to play? Whatever their friends are playing. And whatever their friends are playing are the kids' genre games that are probably not only gameplay-wise geared towards children, but also content-wise geared towards children. Like the games that don't have childlike content also gameplay-wise are not fun for kids to play either. And maybe that's how that came to be. What do all of you think of that play-by-play?
Video games are different than movies and other art forms in that you spend a lot of time with them. And so along with the lines of what Phil is saying is that because of that, as they've branched out, you do have more options, more diversity in the games, as you guys are saying, because gamers and non-gamers, when we approach video games, we have a lot of influence over what gets developed and pushed on. Like now you see all these different versions of Candy Crush because there's something there that draws certain types of people in. And so there's a lot of different types of games because of that, versus the way the movie industry, which is, although you have a lot of creative film developers out there, what we most get exposed to is what a small group of people select for us to have large access to. And so it's much easier for an average person to go into a video game store and select some pretty good content from very different genres and find what they like than it is for, I'm talking about an average as in not super interested, but doesn't mind doing it every once in a while, versus that same person doing that today, even with movies.
Yeah, I was just thinking it would be kind of interesting to visit the parallel world where a more restrictive model came, and then how the advent of the internet and digital distribution might have affected that. Because I feel like one of the things that has made it easier for there to be so many more games is just that you don't need a giant publisher to help pay for your game and distribute it anymore, because you can, create a game and put it on itch.io or Steam. And so I think that has definitely also helped fuel the explosion of game options. It would just be really interesting to think about how, just knowing how laws are often at least 10 years behind technological advances, like what kind of tensions might there have come to be if it's like, oh, well, now there's no physical point of sale anymore for games, because we already know that it's in many ways harder to censor things on the internet. So would we have eventually gotten to an ESRB anyway, even if they didn't start it in the 90s?
Kevin, I was curious about the ESRB as I was listening to you, because I'm not an expert on movies, but I listened to somebody talk a few years ago about the ratings for movies and how that has affected what is produced now. Bottom line is, for a long time, there's been a shift to try to make every big blockbuster PG-13 because they make the most money, right? And so it has shifted what people are willing to put their money and their time into. So other types of movies don't get as much of that type of funding. But what I see as a gamer is a huge interest in games that are mature. So my thought as you were discussing and coming towards the ESRB was, well, I wonder if the video game developers and the big companies, Nintendo and Sega at the time, if they were watching what was going on in the motion picture industry and wondering if they develop a rating system, is that going to start affecting our bottom line as suddenly certain games don't generate any profit anymore? But 30 years later, we've seen something different in the video game industry, where you can create a game that is mature, that sells $200 million, $400 million worth of games. You can make a video game that's just for kids that sells a couple $100 million worth of games. So there's actually something different occurring with video games when it comes to this rating system, tied into the other things we're saying.
That's a really interesting point, Elford. And I have a couple of thoughts on that. One is just that the movie industry in the 80s was a much more mature market than the video game industry was at the time. Like the video game industry is still fairly young, but was even younger in the 90s. And so the fact like the video game market has had a lot more room to continue growing, and the video game consumer has continued continued to age. And so there's just so much room for, like, there are now so many 20 and 30 and 40 and 50-year-olds who play games. So like the average video game player probably is old enough to buy an M-rated game, if only because, not to say that there aren't, maybe half of all gamers are younger than that, but because there are so many older gamers now too, there's just, the room for that. And while conversely, people just have stopped going as much to movies. And I mean, there are certainly people, I think, in the movie industry who would say that video games are partially to blame for people not seeing as many movies because, your games are so good. Now, I don't need to like haul my ass to a theater and pay $20 for a 2-hour experience when I can get a comparable quality for $60 that'll last me 40 hours.
Both of you just made points that helped me understand something that was confusing me a few minutes ago that's related to that. Sort of the notion that the ESRB inadvertently created the opportunity for more video games. And now today, like the small, medium, large thing, kids are less likely to go out and find a video game that's not appropriate for them based on the number of choices they have available to them. And somehow that happened by having an ESRB that was kind of a copy of the MPAA. And yet there are so many more video games being produced now than there were in the 90s. But it feels like there are essentially the exact same number of wide distribution movies coming out now as there were in the 90s. So like Elford, that speaks to how modern movies have to be all things to all people because there are only so many movies that can make money. Whereas with video games, there's a video game for everybody.
I think there are also some people who are taking the messages of we can get a whole lot of attention if we make a controversial game or taking like the Night Trap model. I feel like we don't have a Postal, for example, without a Panic that creates the ESRB. Like a market where you could have a game that is specifically catered to controversy. This whole idea that we could cater to extremes, and there is definitely that. And one thing you definitely see in the 1990s and the 2000s, the marketing gets edgier and is trying to push more to this audience. And the trade-off of that too is this kind of changed the gamer crowd too, because if you follow a lot of gamer culture in the 90s and 2000s, there's a certain defensiveness to gamer culture. It's an outsider, it's an edgy culture, but it's also like, we know that the stuffed shirts and the suits like Joe Lieberman are going to come down on us. And so we are going to come down on any pushback. And that kind of becomes how we get the very much like dude-centric, we're going to shut down the SJWs and kind of stuff. Like it goes in really dark places, this kind of thing. But at the same point, you also have people start saying, we need to be the moral arbiters of society because, M-rated games are infiltrating our young children and are going to corrupt them. And this creates things like guys like David Walsh of the National Institute of Me and the Family saying the games are rated improperly and we need to get rid of the ESRB and replace it with the system we've developed. And guys like Lee Lin Yi and Hillary Clinton saying that we need penalties that government is going to impose for violations of the ESRB. And what's interesting is that the ESRB in the 1990s and 2000s kind of sets the terms of the debate, where it's like how well the ESRB is doing this. And this gets us guys like Joe Lieberman sticking around and like guys like Dave Grossman, things like Jack Thompson, and saying that, video games are so extreme and a bit extreme for years. And this also helps create the atmosphere for violent video game research and saying like video games do this, that, and the other for talking about what's the impact of violent video games on people. Because one of the things that people were talking about at the time was we don't know what violent video games are doing to people. And so that sparks that trend. So much of what we think about as the modern idea of video games as an entertainment media comes out of this. And that's so fascinating that the same thing that created like BioShock and Elden Ring created Jack Thompson.
So related to that parallel, Kevin, another thing that I think is weird is that in this quest to make sure that children only play children's games or mostly play children's games, that happened inadvertently through creating more video games and more access to video games and not less.
And there's definitely an argument to be made now with the digital distribution model being the default. There's a question about whether or not the ESRB is relevant anymore because games are so diverse and you can get them from pretty much anywhere and you don't need to deal with retailers anymore. You could download a game directly from the publishers. Like how much teeth the ESRB has anymore is also a really interesting question. Like in Steam, you can enter any age and just go and download the game.
Yeah, but what's the theme here? It's not about what good we do or what the impact is. The theme is who has control. Like, that's what it's always been about. All of the players involved. It's not about the means they're trying to achieve. It's who has control. Does Nintendo have control? Does Sega have control? Does Joe Lieberman have control? So I guess something I would posit is that the ESRB ratings on video games is what provides the illusion of control that allows for the permeation and distribution of games. If we didn't have that illusion, then we would have to pump the brakes on everything.
And so, yeah, that reshapes the way that the entire path of the industry goes. I think it pretty much wraps up this long journey. I guess I'll wrap up as we usually do then say, and that will do it for today's episode of Scandalous Games. If you like what we're doing, you want to help the show, subscribe or follow us wherever you get your podcasts, and give us a rating on iTunes. If you want to learn more, check out our website, scandalousgamespodcast.wordpress.com, where I publish the show notes and the sources for every episode. Our theme music is Occam Seek Me by Seek Knowledge via the Free Music Archive. Use under CC BY NCS 3.0 US license. If you have a question, comment, or idea for a topic for a future episode, email us at scandalousgamespodcast@gmail.com. And until next time, I'm Kevin Impellizeri.
I'm Phil Thomas.
I'm Elford Stephens.
I'm Andy Hunter.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you next Scandal. Subscribe to Fat Roll Gaming on YouTube.